and welcome. I am here today with Mike Deml, a medical sociologist at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. And today we are going to be talking about vaccine hesitancy. Mike, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Danielle.
No problem. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background to get us started.
Sure. So in March 2020, I finished and defended my PhD at Swiss TPH, Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, on vaccine hesitancy and underimmunization in the Swiss context. And so my background before that, actually, I studied sociology. I did my master's degree at the University of Geneva in sociology and studied HIV prevention. And then following that with the PhD in public health and epidemiology, I really was able to solidify some of my experience in those fields while using my background in social sciences.
Great, super. So maybe we just jump into it. We've seen the power of science and industry in being able to develop a vaccine against the coronavirus in less than a year. This is quite an amazing feat. How are we able to do this so quickly?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the coronavirus vaccines that have been developed so far, so from laboratory to market, have been the most rapidly produced vaccines ever in history. And so we also need to think about the context in which they were produced. So we were facing a global pandemic. There was a real sense of urgency. Governments, industry, and researchers got together in private-public partnerships in order to produce a vaccine or several vaccines as quickly as possible, because as coronavirus was spreading, death tolls were mounting, and we were seeing that our regular mitigation measures of hand hygiene, wearing face masks, they weren't adequate. So we had an influx of resources and a lot of effort. So there were more than 150 vaccines in development at a single time, which has just never happened before. So we also saw new technologies being used, particularly mRNA technology, in the production of vaccination.
How can we trust that the vaccines are safe and effective?
Yeah, so this is one of the really fundamental questions when it comes to any vaccination, but particularly in the context of coronavirus, this is a new vaccine, new vaccines that we're seeing. And it's important to note that although they were produced very quickly with kind of new technologies, but also new manufacturing processes. So there were clinical trials going on while, as they were further along in the clinical trial process, manufacturing was also going on in parallel, so that once it was approved, that we would have sufficient amounts of vaccines to be distributed in the public. So coming back to the question of safety and efficacy, we know that although it was quick, none of the safety or efficacy protocols that are in place when it comes to manufacturing vaccinations, they were all respected. So there was no compromise there for safety or efficacy, no shortcuts were made. And then also, once it gets towards the end of clinical trials, there are advisory boards, bodies, commissions that analyze the efficacy and safety data that's made available. And then most countries have these, including Switzerland, that analyze all of this data and consider it before making a recommendation and approving it for use in the general population.
So despite all of this information that we have, and knowing that there were no corners cut to develop the vaccine, people still tend to be hesitant when it comes to vaccines. What are people's main concerns?
One of the main things is it comes down to people being concerned about the safety, efficacy, and necessity of vaccination, which really is at the heart of vaccine hesitancy. Is it safe? Is it going to cause more harm to my body than the disease that it's supposed to protect against would? So that's one question.
Right.
Efficacy, is it going to work? Is it worth the effort of going and getting an injection? Is it going to protect me against the disease? And then the necessity, and this is more of a new concern. Do I really need this vaccine? Because a lot of the diseases that we get vaccinated against, we don't see them as commonly now, because people do get vaccinated at rates that are sufficient enough for us to, for example, in Switzerland, we don't see polio anymore. And that's because people have gotten vaccinated enough. So when people don't see it, or they don't have experience with those types of diseases, we wonder, is it really necessary to get it?
Mhm.
One of the more, I guess, recent scandals when it came to vaccination is the whole mumps, measles, and rubella vaccination. I'll call it a scandal, but at the end of the day, it turned out to be a good story. But in 1998, Andrew Wakefield, a scientist from the UK, medical doctor and scientist, published a paper in The Lancet that linked the MMR vaccine, so mumps, measles, rubella, to autism. And so, of course, there was immediate concern from many, many parents and other doctors and scientists about this issue.
Mhm.
But after further investigation into this and replication of the study design, it was found out that actually his results weren't valid. And some of the material that he published was falsified, and it was just bad science. And so this has been disproven over and over and over again that there is no link between autism and the MMR vaccine. And just as an example about what that one piece of bad information or how we link this can have a lasting impact. So in the UK from 1998, once this was published, the rates of MMR vaccination just plummeted among the population. And it took about 20 years before the rates got back up to the same level as they were before this article.
And when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, is there a certain group of individuals that tend to be more hesitant than others?
Sure. This is a really interesting question, and I can talk a little bit from my experience of looking into this question in Switzerland and the literature on this topic, which is really kind of Western country focused, rich country, high income countries, and from the Swiss context and these other a lot of Anglo-Saxon, so a lot of the US, UK, and Australia and Canadian studies are showing that there are trends and associations with vaccine hesitancy being linked to people who are upper middle class, people who are a bit more highly educated, so about bachelor's level or even master's degree. Also, people who adhere to what's called, we refer to as healthism. So this is really proactive information-seeking behavior. People who eat, for example, organic food, they pay attention to what they eat, how often they exercise, but also the idea of young mothers, for example, who are really concerned with the immunity that they're able to transfer to their children naturally, either through breastfeeding or from the placenta as part of childbirth.
And I guess we can't really talk about vaccine hesitancy without also mentioning the anti-vaxxers. So how would you differentiate these two groups of individuals?
Sure, and this is a really, really important question, and that's why I'm glad that you asked, because a lot of people tend to associate vaccine hesitancy or vaccine hesitant people to anti-vaxxers, meaning that they group them together. And for me, that's, from a public health perspective, that's a really big mistake to make. And so when we talk about anti-vaxxers, these are people who are just 100% fundamentally opposed to vaccination. So never ever going to vaccinate. They're really far on one end of the spectrum. And so the behavior that they engage is to never vaccinate. Anti-vaxxers also tend to be quite vocal, and that's why we hear a lot about them. So they make YouTube videos, they make documentaries, they're more activists, they have an activist approach. Whereas vaccine hesitancy is more a sentiment, an attitude, a perspective. These are people who have questions about vaccination. And from a public health perspective, and that's why I insist on this, is these are people who, they're not opposed to vaccination, they just wonder about it. Like, is it going to make me or my child healthy? Am I going to risk anything by doing this? They have legitimate concerns that if they ask about other medication or other treatments, that, you know, that's what we're supposed to do as patients. If a doctor proposes a treatment to me that I've never heard of before, I'm allowed to ask questions about it. And that's the same thing with vaccine hesitant people, is they have legitimate questions and concerns with, I mean, those three things in mind that we talked about before: safety, efficacy, and necessity of vaccination.
That's super interesting. And When we talk about vaccine hesitancy amongst ourselves and with family and friends, what's the best way to go about this?
So I think what's important for me is that we acknowledge that these concerns are legitimate and that we can have a discussion about vaccine hesitancy without denigrating people for their questions. And so that's often been the case. And this is why I caution against grouping anti-vax people or sentiment with vaccine hesitancy, because it's really not the same thing. Generally, with vaccine hesitant people, you can have open conversations. They are looking for information. They want true, balanced, and neutral information. So being able to engage in dialogue with them instead of a top-down approach saying all vaccinations are great, you don't have to worry about it, the science is there, you just need to trust us.
Yes.
But engage with them, explain the science behind it, explain how we know things are safe, how things are effective, but also acknowledging that there are maybe uncertainties or things that we don't know, because in medicine or with treatment or medication, we can never guarantee 100% certainty. And the same is true about vaccination.
Yes. So from your perspective as a medical sociologist, why is it so important for people to get vaccinated?
So when it comes to vaccination in general, we have a long enough history showing that, coupled with our improved sanitary measures over the last 50, 100 years, vaccination really has been successful in reducing the amount of infectious disease, the spread of disease. And vaccination, we shouldn't forget, is not just a single act that protects only you, but for most vaccinations, that it does have an impact on the community that you live in. So by vaccinating yourself, you often will benefit others by protecting them.
In the context of the pandemic going on, what is your opinion on the importance of getting vaccinated today?
And we're at a really particular time in vaccination implementation, globally, but also in Switzerland. So it's February 2021. We've started vaccinating the public. At this point in time, we have a specific order that we're going in with priority groups. And so this is where I think it's important for us to think about who these priority groups are. So the oldest of the population, the most at risk for severe consequences of coronavirus. So this is where I would recommend, again, people to have discussions with their healthcare providers about this decision. And then to make the decision that's most adapted to their situation, right? So we have a resource issue of where should the vaccines go first. And also the vaccine has arrived, or the vaccines have arrived at a time when we're more than a year into this. We're seeing that the tools that we have already, so physical distancing, keeping our distance away from people, wearing masks, regular hand hygiene, measures mandated by the state, recommendations from the state, that this just hasn't been sufficient alone so far. If we don't want this to go on forever, that we need to take advantage of the new tools that we also have. And vaccination is going to be one of these tools that will help us as we. So I will also argue that vaccination is only one of these tools and that it's going to be a multifaceted approach. For health crises, it's important to recognize that it's complex, and our responses also have to be complex and multifaceted.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us. That was incredibly insightful and helpful to help us all understand vaccine hesitancy a bit more and the importance of being vaccinated, especially during the pandemic. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.